Hello again, my name is Frederik Harhoff. I'm Professor Emeritus in International Law at the University of Southern Denmark. We spoke a bit last time about the use of force under international law, and today we're going to venture further into the area of armed conflict by looking at the laws of armed conflict. The laws of armed conflict are laws that apply once the war has broken out, once there is an armed conflict. Basically, the use of armed force, which we discussed in the last session, was mostly concentrated on how to avoid war from breaking out. But once the war has broken out, then we are dealing with the laws of armed conflict. The general rule of the laws of armed conflict, and I'll get back to what the laws are, but the general rule underlying them all is the protection of those who are affected by the war. That is to say, the wounded and sick, those who have taken prisoners, the civilians, anyone who is affected by the war is entitled to some sort of protection against the effects of the war. That is what the laws of armed conflict are all about. The laws are found in 4 conventions and 2 additional protocols that attach to the 4 conventions. These 4 conventions were suggested and negotiated and adopted by the International Committee of the Red Cross, the so-called ICRC, the Red Cross. Now, where is the ICRC based? Well, they're based in Geneva, of course, because the ICRC was originally created as an international organization by a Swiss gentleman way back in the previous century in 1850-something, 54. So that's why the conventions are called the Geneva Conventions, because they were all adopted in Geneva. The 4 conventions were adopted shortly after the Second World War in 1949, and they deal with various aspects of protection against those who are protected against the effects of war. First of all, we have the soldiers, because they are the ones who are being shot at and who shoot themselves. They kill the enemy or they wound the enemy. And so they are the immediate persons who are affected by the war. Of course, they are directly involved in the war. So the first Geneva Convention from 1949 deals with the protection of the wounded and sick in war on land. So these are the land soldiers. And I'll come back to what the protection of these soldiers are. The second convention is the same, except that this is for the maritime crews, for the Navy soldiers on board the ships. So the second convention is about the protection of persons affected by the war, wounded and sick in wars at sea. So the first 2 conventions are fairly similar. In fact, we rarely come across the second convention because sea wars are not very regular anymore. So it's seldom that we have a war, a sea battle. But we do have a lot of land battles. And for all the conflicts and the wars that are fought on land, it's the first convention that applies. The third convention is about the protection of those who have taken prisoners and prisoners of war. A prisoner of war is a person who lawfully takes part in the armed conflicts, either as a soldier, which is 80% of those who are affected by the third convention, but that can be taken as prisoner of war, or members of militias who carry their arms openly and who are somehow involved in the conflict from the side of one or the other of the warring parties. So soldiers, including armed groups or corpses that are associated with the armed forces of a state, if they are taken prisoners, they had the right to be treated as a prisoner of war, and I shall come back to that. That's a very special and very privileged position compared to what other ordinary people are being often if they are taken prisoners. There's a huge difference between prisoners of war and other civilian prisoners. The fourth convention, Geneva Convention, is the Convention on the Protection of Civilians in an armed conflict. Civilians, of course, they are affected in so many ways during the war. Just look at the war in Ukraine for the moment. The civilians appear to be the main targets of the Russian attacks, which is terrible. So attacks on civilians, deliberate attacks on civilians, is clearly something that is forbidden under the Fourth Convention, protecting civilians in armed conflict. Now, when do we have an armed conflict? We have an armed conflict where there is extensive use of force between one state against another. Extensive use of force is not only a border skirmish, if you can imagine, for instance, on the border between Pakistan and India, if there's an occasion exchange of crossfire across the border, well, that does not amount to an armed conflict. So it is widespread use of armed force over a certain period of time. So if you have that between two states, then you have an international armed conflict as is defined. Because the 4 Geneva Conventions only apply to international armed conflicts. I repeat, the 4 Geneva Conventions only apply to international armed conflicts. Civil wars are not covered by these 4 conventions. That is to say that there is in each of the 4 conventions, there is one provision that has the same wording in each of them. It's called the Common Article 3. Article 3 in the 4 conventions is identical. Has the same text. And Article 3 sets out minimum standards for any armed conflict, be it international or non-international. So you can say that even though the 4 Geneva Conventions only apply to international armed conflicts between 2 or more states, then there is one provision, namely the Common Article 3, that sets the minimum standards for any kind of conflict, including, of course, also civilian conflict. I will read out the wording of Article 3, and you'll see it's very primitive. It basically requires that those who are victims of a non-international conflict shall be treated humanely. There you have it. But let me go back to the 4 Geneva Conventions. They only apply to international armed conflict between 2 or more states. They set out, for instance, the first convention sets out what legitimate targets the armed forces of a state can use lawfully against the enemy. They say there's a principle of precaution. Before they launch an attack, they have to be very sure that they are not targeting civilian targets and so on. The second convention we will drop here. The third convention about the prisoners of war offers a special protection to prisoners of war because they are agents of their states. They have rights very similar to diplomats, as we discussed in one of the earlier sessions. A regular soldier of the armed forces belonging to a party involved in an international armed conflict, he or she is a state agent. And so if you take her prisoner and put her into a prisoner of camp of yours, then a camp for prisoners, then you have to treat her with respect of the fact that she is an agent for her state. That is to say, she has the right to be visited by a doctor, examined by a doctor or a nurse. She has the right to contact her family. She has the right to contact the ICTY, the Red Cross. And in fact, the Red Cross will come to the prison camp
have meet the prisoners in order to ensure that they're being well treated. You're not allowed to put a prisoner of war into a single cell. Prisoners of war have to be allowed to walk out freely in the open within the confined area of the prison camp, of course, but they are entitled, they are allowed, they have the right to be kept together in community and to play football or whatever they do outside. So you cannot put a prisoner of war into a single cell unless you do it for disciplinary purposes. If one of the prisoners of war has behaved very badly and attacked one of the soldiers, okay, you put him in a single cell for a week or two, and that's a disciplinary punishment. But other than that, prisoners of war have the right to be walking around freely in the open air. Then in night, you can lock them up in barracks. And of course, if you have female prisoners of war, then they have to be separate from the men. They all have the right to also be paid money for whatever work they're ordered to do, and so on and so forth. Officers have to be kept separately from private soldiers, and so on. So, as soon as the conflict brings to an end, you immediately have to release your prisoners of war. And of course, it goes without saying that you cannot subject prisoners of war to torture or to any kind of inhuman treatment. So you can imagine that being a prisoner of war in an armed conflict gives you a lot of privileges compared to the next guy who is not a member of the armed forces and who is just thrown into prison and the key is dropped and you never see him again. So there is really very good reasons why we should give prisoners of war special treatment, and we do, and that's what the Third Convention is all about. It is a war crime, actually, to subject prisoners of war to torture or to any degree of inhuman treatment. I'll get back to that in a moment. And finally, as civilians, you're not allowed to make civilians the target of a military attack. Look at what Russia is doing now in the Ukraine. Apparently, Russian forces are targeting civilian buildings, residences, schools, hospitals, whatever, and now even railway stations and power stations, which will take away the power and water from civilians. Such installations are also protected by the Fourth Geneva Convention. You're not allowed to attack them. And if you do, you commit a war crime. War crimes. In the end of each of the 4 Geneva Conventions, you will find a few provisions dealing with war crimes. And let me take you just read out from Article 147 of the 4th Geneva Convention. It reads, the higher contracting parties, and that is, if I may just include it here, all states of the world have ratified the 4 Geneva Conventions. All 193 states. The high contracting parties undertake to enact any legislation necessary to provide effective penal sanctions for persons committing or ordering to be committed any act of the grave breaches. So here is an international legal obligation in an international treaty for each member state to go home and introduce penal legislation to make sure that these crimes can and will be prosecuted domestically under national law. And so what are the grave crimes? The grave crimes are the following. The grave breaches to which the preceding article relates shall be those involving any of the following acts if committed against persons or property protected by the 4th Convention on Civilians. 1. Willful killing, torture, inhuman treatment, including biological experiments, willfully causing great suffering or serious injury to body or health, unlawful deportation or transfer, or unlawful confinement of a protected person. That is, for instance, to put him into jail without a basis. compelling a protected person to serve in the forces of a hostile power, or willfully depriving a protected person of the rights of a fair and regular trial. So if you want to prosecute a civilian for something, then there has to be a fair and regular trial. Taking of hostages is forbidden. And extensive destruction and appropriation of property not justified by military necessity and carried out unlawfully, unwantedly. Now, in my view, what goes on in Ukraine at the moment with Russian forces targeting power stations and water stations, that cannot be said in any case to be justified by military necessity. I'm sorry. That is a war crime. And if ever these things are to be taken seriously, the Russian courts and judges have to address these issues and prosecute Russian soldiers who committed these crimes once the war is over. And if Russia doesn't prosecute these criminals, then Russia will be exposed to huge critics from the outside. Because they have signed up, they have undertaken to enact any legislation necessary to provide effective penal sanctions for person committing these war crimes. And here you have a definition of the war crimes in the end of each of the 4 conventions, and protection of civilians. Okay, these are the crimes that you can commit in this 4th convention. And extensive destruction and appropriation of property not justified by military necessity and carried out unlawfully and wantonly. It's a war crime. And Russia has to prosecute these people by itself, unless they are brought before the International Criminal Court, but that's another matter. At the moment, Russia has not ratified the statute of the International Criminal Court. Now, these were the 4 Geneva Conventions from 1949. Then came the Vietnam War, and that exposed some gray areas in the old conventions. So the international community, and certainly the ICRC, the Red Cross, thought that it was appropriate to prop up the 4 Geneva Conventions, to update them, so to say. That's why the ICRC convened a new international treaty in 1974, I think it was, and after 3 years of negotiation, the international community was able to adopt 2 additional protocols. The first of which only deals with international armed conflicts, while the second, for the first time, really adopted an international convention on non-international armed conflicts. Unfortunately, it is not all countries that have ratified the old 4 conventions that have also ratified additional Protocol 1 and 2. In fact, it's a very limited amount of states that have ratified additional Protocol 2, because most states think that, internal armed conflicts, civil wars, we would rather deal that with ourselves and not have the international community interfere in that. So many states are reluctant to go along with the second additional protocol. But the first additional protocol is important because it adds a few other crimes to the crimes that have been lined out in the and the additional crimes that were added to the 4 conventions is to make the civilian population or individual civilians the object of an attack. Just think about how important this provision is. Now, unfortunately, it is only included in the first additional protocol. And I think, I'm not sure at this time, I have to get back to you on this. I think that Russia has ratified this first additional protocols, but the US has not, that's for sure. And most European countries have also ratified the first additional protocol. But not, I think it's about 60 or 70 states that have ratified additional protocol 1 and less that have ratified additional protocol 2. So the law of armed conflicts is the laws that apply to the use of force in an armed conflict. It basically provides rules on how you should act and how you should not act, of course, and then it sets out the crimes, defines the crimes very narrowly, so that nobody should have any doubts about whether, for instance, attacks on civilians buildings is acceptable in a wartime or not. It is not. Thank you so much.